In-depth journalism in the Memphis community, the Daily Memphian is of Memphis, not just in Memphis, and seeks to tell the stories of this city. TheDailyMemphian.com. Truth in place.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Daily Memphian Tigers podcast. I'm your host, Greg Gaston, joined this week by Tim Buckley, Daily Memphian deputy sports editor and senior writer, and Parth Upadhyaya, Tigers basketball beat writer. Natalie Van Gundy is our producer. We are all in separate locations bringing you this podcast, but excited because anytime there's breaking news, it's always a fun time. And we will begin with the breaking news from this morning. FedEx announcing an NIL program for University of Memphis student athletes. They will invest $5 million per year for the next 5 years in those student athletes who will be promoting FedEx initiatives, with the program initially centered around football, men's and women's basketball, and additional women's sports. Tim, this is huge news for the university.
Yeah, it's a nice little windfall. When was the last time anybody offered you $25 million over 5 years? Look, it's what's needed to be competitive in this ever evolving Wild West world that NIL and the transfer portal has turned college sports into. You need big bucks. FedEx is stepping up with what is obviously big bucks. I just got off the phone with Laird Veach, and to put it in perspective, he basically said, and there's no reporting, there's no transparency on any of this. There's no central database where everybody individually as a university has to say, we're putting this much into it, we're putting that much into it. So, there's numbers that are overinflated. This is me talking. There's numbers that are overinflated. There's numbers that are underreported. Who knows who's really telling the truth? There's more Pinocchio's noses in college sports today than there ever have been. But what Laird was saying was, in general, the Tigers go from, kind of in the general upper echelon of the AAC to now maybe at the top of the AAC. But they also go now to being competitively, both regionally and nationally, in the whole NIL world. And that's what you need. Now, this is me talking again, not Laird. That's what you need in order to survive, what really is kind of, just turning into, a survivor's island of who's going to be left standing when it's all said and done, because the current structure with 100 plus schools and FBS and all that is not what we're going to see 5-10 years down the road.
It's an arms race. There's no question about it. It's interesting because the reaction has been coming in fast and furious. This has become a national story. This is what NIL is all about, exactly the way they're doing it with FedEx and involving the student athletes in initiatives from FedEx, including FedEx Cares and in-person events, social media programs. But I'll use one journalist as an example. Just moments ago, before we started to tape, was Dan Wetzel, who tweeted out and said that this is another reason why Memphis should be in the ACC or be in the Big 12, that they are a power school that should be in a power conference. Now, I don't know if this gets them over the hump. First of all, there has to be more movement, which people think there will be. This can't hurt, though, Tim.
It's one more egg in the basket. Nobody cares what any journalist, whether it's a national guy or a local guy, cares about whether they should be in or not. And nobody, frankly, really cares about what the fans think, because most of the Memphis fans think they should be in, and then people from rival schools or people who did make the jump up, or people who are already at what we used to call a Power 5 school, might snicker and laugh. Nobody cares about what any of that says. It's what the president and chancellors ultimately decide in the end. And how do you make yourself more enticing? Well, you add the renovated stadium component. You add the we're competitive regularly on a national basis, whether it's, bowl game appearances or NCAA tournament appearances, which obviously the Tigers didn't have this year. It's, are your coaches high profile enough? And now this egg in the basket, are you competitive NIL wise? And this, in their estimation, makes them that, and there's no reason to believe that they won't be, because it's a nice chunk of change. But does it put them over the top? Is it all they need? No, not by any stretch of the imagination.
If you do the math, $50 million, the matching $50 million, which Memphis has to come up with their own $50 million for the renovations of Simmons Bank Liberty Stadium, plus 5 years at $5 million pop, that's 25. You add them together, that's $75 million in this particular two projects donated by FedEx. But again, Memphis has to match, as we talked about with the Simmons Bank Liberty Stadium project. Also with this and some of the stipulations involving this particular NIL deal, Memphis needs to also raise $2.5 million on their own.
Yeah, I kind of in this instance interpreted that, even though it's being called a match, is more of a challenge, whereas the other one was truly a match. This, and I say that in part because apparently in the last school year or cycle, whatever you want to call it, the Tigers already were in the $2 to $2.5 million range in NIL money that was, exchanging hands anyway. And
Right.
So now they just kind of need to sustain that. They need renewals, but if what they had in place last year translates to next year, they'll have that taken care of. So I don't think there's any concern about coming up with that or anything on anybody's end, whether it's FedEx's or the universities or whatever, just based on what they already had in place. Now the stadium, that's fundraising, and that's talking about having to raise the funds before certain amounts are unlocked, if you will. I think it's a little bit apples and oranges, even though that same term of match is being applied.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. That's the way I incorporated it as well, is that it's more of a challenge than it is a match. So FedEx will host its first in-person NIL initiative at the spring game tomorrow. 3:00 is when they'll kick it off at Simmons Bank Liberty Stadium. They will have an event with a tailgate experience. And again, FedEx will have many initiatives throughout the year that will utilize these student athletes. So as we make the transition to the actual game itself, the blue, the gray, going at it tomorrow at 3. It's a spring game. You're not going to touch the quarterback. There's certain precautions that they're going to take, but you're at least going to see a little bit of football tomorrow. And I know this is just a precursor, Tim, to the excitement that's going to build over the offseason in the camp and into the start of the season because of the high expectations for this football program.
Absolutely. First, I did, since you brought it up, I did want to make an announcement. Coincidentally, spring game tomorrow, also the kickoff of the Memphis Media NIL Fund. So if there's, anybody who wants to sponsor us, we're free to
Sure.
hand out pens and pads of paper tomorrow.
Sign me up.
If the money's right. Misnomer, not a game. It's the 15th spring practice. It's, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. It's, we used to call it two-hand touch. It's a glorified practice meant to get people in the stadium on a Saturday, enjoy what hopefully is a beautiful day and not a rainy mess. Watch some football in the spring, run through a couple plays, show absolutely nothing from the playbook. They've done all the work. Even the whole idea of spring practice is kind of a misnomer and a little bit, not really what it actually is, because these guys have been in there since January working out and working alongside coaches. We've seen the videos. It's at every university. This is just the formal 15 practices where they're allowed to be a little more hands-on, and this is the last one of them. You hope to get out of it with all your decisions have already been made to this point. Nobody's going to win or lose a starting job based on what's going to happen on Saturday. It's what they've already done to this point. Backup quarterback, that's a battle. They got some things to decide on the offensive line. You'll be looking, to see what's going on there, who's snapping at center, those kind of things. But look, I covered some actual back in the day spring games when they like went at it. And you had guys like getting carted off on stretchers and stuff. And there was a certain point where the coaches were like, this has got to stop. And now we're at that point.
Well, even though you're correct, you are a buzzkill trying to excite folks to go out there to the game. Still go out there and watch I'm using the air quotes, the game tomorrow starting at 3:00. For anything else, you'll see me on the sideline. So there you go. It's worth coming out to Simmons Bank Liberty Stadium. Tim, final thing for you. It has not been a mass exodus, and nobody expected it to be. But with this new spring portal, more opportunities for student athletes to move on and go somewhere else. And most of the kids that are moving around the nation at this point are those that realize they're not going to be starters. They may not get playing time. There's a couple of decent names out there. Dallin Hayden, a local guy who was at Ohio State, who's out there now looking for a new place to land in. But for Memphis, some of the bigger names of about a half dozen they lost. Jay Ducker, who redshirted last year, was part of that running back core. They did lose Diego Brumfield, who was a starter at times. But other than that, not a lot of movement. And I don't expect Ryan Silverfield to be out there looking for a bunch of players. Maybe he'll bring a player or two in, but probably not too much.
Yeah, he indicated as much when he spoke with several reporters, including Frank Bonner. Like the running back Ducker, 544 yards 2 years ago. But they bring in Mario Anderson. He saw where he was on the depth chart. That one kind of makes sense. I don't know what the deal is with the cornerback Brumfeld. He actually started 12 or 13 games, if you can believe it, last season. So I don't know. I honestly don't know if that was, he wasn't happy where he was on the depth chart, if he had been knocked down from a starting job and maybe there was no anticipation that he can win it back in the fall. I don't know if he's going to get NIL money from somewhere else. I don't know what that one was, but you're losing the starter there. But to me, and you might lose some more after the spring game too, because the portal is open until the 30th of April, I believe. But it's kind of natural attrition at this point. I don't think it's anything to be overly concerned about by any stretch of the imagination. And as far as bringing them in, you know what? You lose a couple, you add a couple. That's you just kind of make the numbers work. But as Ryan Silverfield said, if you're bringing 20 guys in out of the portal in, at this time of year, you didn't do your work in December. And so they did their work in December. So I think Silverfield feels comfortable with where they're at.
Well, Tim will be one of the members of the media, along with myself, that'll be at the spring game. Make sure to read what all the good guys at the DM have to say about spring football, the spring game in the Daily Memphian. And next week, we will wrap up the Memphis Tigers podcast as we wrap up the spring session and the spring game with the gang. So stay tuned for that. So, Tim, we'll let you get back to other things that you're doing over there at the Daily Memphian, and we'll talk next week.
Sounds good. Thanks, Greg.
All right, let's bring in Parth Upadhyaya, the Tigers basketball beat writer for the Daily Memphian. As we always kind of laugh about, Parth, never a dull moment with Tigers basketball. There's always something going on. Of course, today the big news was the NIL and FedEx, which will benefit the men's basketball team, the women's basketball team, the football team, and other entities at the University of Memphis. But right now, the concern, if there is a concern from the fan base, is Penny has a long way to go to fill that roster. He's being very deliberate. He's being very specific on who he wants. It's not just going out there to try to get the best talent and assemble the best talent. And the latest addition, since we last spoke last week, is Colby Rogers, who you've had a chance to talk to. I had him on my radio show today, Friday morning, as we tape this, and he is a delight. This is a veteran player, speaks eloquently, I like what this guy brings to the table. Anytime you can bring in a player who shoots nearly 41% from three, you got to like that.
Yeah, no doubt about it. He set the school record at Wichita State for most three-pointers in the season, hit 99.
Wow.
Not just hit 99, not just shot at a high volume. I think it was about 7 attempts per game, but shot at a high clip as well, right? Like 41% from three, was one of the best three-point shooters by percentage, by makes, by attempts. Any way you want to statistically measure his three-point shooting, he was one of the top 35 or 40 shooters in the country. This is a guy who was, highly coveted, recruited by Alabama. Kansas was in on him. And in fact, he told me it came down to Bama and Memphis, essentially. It was a two-person race with Kansas kind of in the mix as well. So, you look at the teams that were after him and you look at his production, whether it be in the AAC or elsewhere, all the boxes kind of check out. And this is a guy who's going to kind of offer instant offense and certainly be a starter for the Memphis Tigers next season.
He talked about when I interviewed him about how important it was for the team. He kept talking team. In this day and age,
Yep.
when you think about players, you think, well, they're in it individually. They're in it for themselves. And why wouldn't they be with name, image, and likeness and the chance to get to that next level? You care about how many shots you're getting. And that was the problem with Memphis this past season. But he seems to be, and again, saying one thing and doing another thing are two different things, but he seems to be bought in on the team concept. And he said that was a major part of what Penny emphasized when they met.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting as well. Now, obviously, we hear a lot of the same things from guys, no matter what year it is. You heard it last year from the group that came in from the transfer portal. You heard it 2 years ago, whatever it may be. And like you said, it's one thing to say it. It's another to put it into action, once they do step on campus here at the University of Memphis. But this is a guy who said, like you mentioned team numerous times in my conversation with him as well. Talked about wanting to step into a more leadership role, whether that be vocal, by example, whatever it may be. That was important to him. And he wanted to lead on a team that's going to have potential to not only go to the NCAA tournament, but make a run in it, is what he told me. Something else I thought was cool was PJ Haggerty, who obviously was Memphis's first get in the portal a few weeks back. Point guard from Tulsa, one of the most coveted transfers in the portal this cycle. PJ Haggerty actually called Colby Rogers and said, "Hey man, I want to play with you. I know Memphis is recruiting you. I know you're being looked at by other big time high major programs as well, but come to Memphis and we'll make something special happen." So to see that kind of chemistry, if you will, already form where guys are recruiting other guys that they want to play with, and to see what that means to Colby, he expressed that was a large part apparently of why he wanted to come to Memphis, even though he doesn't know who's going to be around him entirely. He does know that the freaking point guard, PJ Haggerty, wants him on the team. He knows that Dane Danger is in the mix. He knows that Nicholas Jourdain says he's going to be in the mix. So, he has belief in those guys and has belief in Penny Hardaway and Rick Stansbury as well. But Greg, you're absolutely right. He didn't talk about, how many shots he's going to get or wanting to impress scouts to go to the NBA. He did mention NBA aspirations, but that wasn't the focal point of my conversation. It sounds like it wasn't the focal point of yours either. It was more so about team, about leadership, and about doing something special at Memphis in that regard.
And Parth, to your point, he was highly complimentary of PJ Haggerty, and who knows who else Penny brings in at the guard positions. And you got to get more guys. He's probably needs 7-8 guys to add to the roster. But the way Rogers was talking, and I also had a chance to talk to Haggerty, as did you, and I appreciate you helping me out, by the way, with getting those interviews. That could be your backcourt right there, right? Haggerty and Rogers could very well be your 1 and 2.
Yeah, no doubt. That could be your 1 and 2. And if David Jones, if they can get him in the fold, and like we'll discuss, I'm sure in a few minutes here, we're not going to know about that until at least late May. May 29th is the deadline for guys to withdraw from the early NBA draft entry process and to be eligible to come back to school. So still, over a month away here as we sit April 19th today on the podcast. But yeah, those two guys, PJ Haggerty at the point, Colby Rogers at the 2, and then David Jones at the 3 would kind of be your three-headed monster in the backcourt. And then they'd have some spots to fill in the front court. Obviously, Dane Danger's in the mix, Nicholas Jourdain. So that may very well be your starting lineup if David Jones chooses to come back, it'd be PJ Haggerty, Colby Rogers, David Jones, Nicholas Jourdain, and Dane Danger. Now, obviously, if David Jones, isn't in the fold, they'll have to find another A1, another big dog to kind of put on the wing there and take on a bulk of the scoring duties. But, to go back to your original point, it's not a bad combination right there. Haggerty and Rogers in your backcourt. That's not a bad 1-2 punch at point and two guard.
Not at all. And it's a great start to putting together this roster, but they got a long way to go.
Long way to go. Yes.
It's interesting because I didn't know what exact date it was that he had to look at the NBA. But David Jones, you wait patiently, because if you can get him back, you want to wait and not bother him and let him do his due diligence. However, and we've talked about this before, as you wait, you still got to fill a roster. You still got to see what kind of NIL money you have. Now, this helps being able to get extra money that's going to be brought into the mix at the University of Memphis through FedEx.
I was going to say, right now, you break off a piece of that $5 million and, you hand it to David Jones and say, hey, come on back. If I'm Penny Hardaway, if I'm Memphis.
Right. And that's the thing, though, Parth, that we've discussed before, and I'm still a little confused. Right. Does David Jones fall into the foreign player category?
That's right.
Which hurt Zach Edey, who talked about it a couple of times, that he wasn't able to cash in on the NIL as much as an American-born player or athlete.
Right.
And David Jones wasn't born here. He was born in the Dominican Republic. So I don't know where it stands with him and how much NIL he can make.
Yeah, and we've talked about it before on here and on your radio show. Like you said, David Jones was born in the DR, and even last year, the holdup for him coming to campus from the Dominican Republic was the student visa aspect of things. He had to wait on that, which is why he didn't get here until late August or even early September, I think, after classes started at the U of M. Mm-hmm. And that, by all accounts, from what I was told from the conversations I had, impacted his NIL earning potential. He was only able to get paid when the team went overseas to the Dominican Republic. Aside from that, he didn't, wasn't able to do these appearances in town at the Tiger Bookstore or at Rendezvous or at Babalu or whatever you want to, do here that the guys were doing, Javon Quinterly and others. He couldn't do those appearances and he couldn't get paid for them. So I don't know how that impacts him this go around, and I'm not sure what the workaround will be. But, a player the caliber of David Jones, who would be, I think, a preseason All-American, I'm pretty sure Memphis and Penny Hardaway find a way to get him his money.
There are a couple of players that were supposed to be in this week that ended up canceling. Not sure if it will be rescheduled. I know Bugs being one of them. I heard that maybe that will be rescheduled. We also had a player that was mentioned for Memphis from Sam Houston State, the Collierville High School, and you'll give me his name in a second. The Collierville High School product ends up going to Ole Miss right down the road.
Bonds, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So where do we stand right now as the next guys that Penny will be able to bring in and host, and where do we go from here? Especially when you look at the bigs with only Dane Danger and Jourdain, but Jourdain not that physical big. He's more a finesse big. They have to find these guys. So what's next on the horizon?
Yeah, there's Morehead State transfer Mark Freeman, who is also a Memphis product, I believe. Greg, you might know more about his Memphis Preps career than I do, but Memphis has demonstrated interest in him, has reached out to him. They've made contact. So that visit has not been scheduled yet as of yesterday evening when I looked into it, but that is something that is going to get scheduled soon, per my knowledge. As far as Barnes, they had him on campus earlier this week. I guess for whatever reason, either he chose not to commit or Memphis chose not to seal that deal, but he's going to Ole Miss, so he's out of the picture. John Bugs III, you mentioned that visit was supposed to happen on Thursday. So yesterday and today, it was a 2-day visit, has now been rescheduled. Arturo Dean is another one who was supposed to be on campus Wednesday and Thursday. So Wednesday and yesterday, also rescheduled. We talked about it on your show and I've said it on other shows. Oftentimes when you talk about rescheduling these visits, it just means that, hey, if other opportunities don't work out for you, or if they don't work out for us, being Memphis in this case, I'm speaking as if I'm Memphis, then we'll revisit. If not, see you later type of deal. So it's tough to see where those two are going, if anywhere, Arturo Dean and John Bugs III. But as far as Mark Freeman, he should be on campus soon. Chris Parker, the small forward from Alabama, is somebody recently who's Memphis has reached out to. And aside from that, I think a lot of the stuff they're doing has been kind of quiet, if that makes sense, kind of working in the background. We've seen a lot less.
Which is just fine. It's just fine, right?
Which is probably the best way to go about it, right? Especially in today's era where other schools are using that as leverage. They're saying, hey, they're finding out what Memphis has offered in terms of NIL package. They're finding out what that pitch is and trying to top it. So it's probably better if you're Rick Stansbury and Penny Hardaway to, go about your business quietly versus having that information broadcast to the public.
Freeman, by the way, Southwind High School in Memphis, averaged 22 points, 8 assists per game in that senior year. They went 29-2, and he's bounced around. So he played this past season at Morehead State. Prior to that, played at Illinois State, started out at Tennessee State, but actually had committed coming out of high school to Long Island University, Brooklyn, but also in between high school and the start of college, something called the Skill Factory in Atlanta, Georgia, which I'm not even familiar with. But here's a guy who's seasoned. And what I like so far, again, from the few that Penny's been able to bring in, he brings in a guy like Colby Rogers, who has 1 year remaining. But he also brings in a PJ Haggerty, who, depending on how things go and if he's NBA ready or wants to hit the portal, he could play a total of 3 years?
3 seasons, yeah, which is amazing to have.
So it's a mixture. It's not just all one and dones. It's a mixture of players, not to mention Harris, the high school senior, who will be coming in once he finishes up his high school.
You mentioned him. Yeah, Jared Harris, 4-star prospect, coming in, obviously, with a clean slate, 4 full years of eligibility left.
All right, so let's shift gears. Let's talk a little scheduling before we wrap things up. And it was a very productive week last week for Memphis and for Coach Hardaway and all those involved in scheduling, because 3 different schools have been announced since we last spoke. UNLV, home and home. Ole Miss, the series continues. The old contract had run out, but they put together a new home and home, both of these starting this season, and a third one starting this season, the 24-25 season. Mississippi State, it's been a while. They're back on the schedule. I think Penny Hardaway is slaying it and putting together a schedule, because I guarantee you he's going after everybody, and there's a lot of no's that he's being told, but he's been able to get a lot of yeses, and that schedule is getting more and more attractive by the day, really.
Yeah, absolutely agree. We talked about heading into last season, how difficult the schedule looked, how rigorous it looked, the non-conference slate at least, and it didn't really pan out that way. It looked like Memphis was picking up some really quality wins, and at the time, we thought they were. But then those teams kind of fell off a cliff, whether it be Arkansas or Missouri, who didn't win a single conference game, which is insane, or others, or Michigan, and that list kind of goes on and on. But this year, of course, anything can happen. Schools can not live up to hype, not live up to expectations, projections, whatever it may be. But this seems like it has the potential to be even stronger than last year, between road trips to Clemson, road trips to Virginia, UNLV in Vegas. You've got the Maui Invitational, which features UConn, North Carolina, Michigan State, Iowa State, Dayton, Colorado. So you've got a loaded field there. All that being said, 10 opponents are already accounted for. Talking about Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Missouri, Clemson, Virginia, UNLV, a neutral site game against San Francisco at the Chase Center, which is going to be pretty cool. And then the 3 games in Maui. That's 10 games already. You've got to think maybe 1 or 2 bye games obviously are going to come. Usually they're against teams that have coaches with Memphis ties, whether it be
bye games, right? Yeah, Alabama State, the Jackson States of the world, right?
Exactly. So maybe a couple of those, and then one more potentially power conference or mid to high major opponent should round this thing out. But even without those 3 games in the fold, no matter who they're against, this is a pretty formidable schedule. And you've got to think, when it shakes out, it's going to be one of the top 20-25 toughest non-conference slates in the country.
I love how they call the game in San Francisco a neutral court game, because it's at the home of the Warriors and not San Francisco's gym. Yeah, that's a neutral court game. Memphis going to San Francisco to play the Dons, considered a neutral court game, but it is what it is.
They'll walk down the road, to go to their neutral site.
Exactly. But again, they had to add home games because the schedule, the non-conference portion of the schedule is attractive, but you rattled off all these road trips. Well, now they add Ole Miss and Mississippi State. Yeah, you would normally like them separate, where 1 year you go to Ole Miss, 1 year Mississippi State's coming to you. You know what I'm saying? Instead of twice,
Right.
both of them coming to you 1 year and you going on the road both times. But they had to make this home schedule more attractive for potential season ticket buyers. And that's what they did. Like you said, I believe they'll add one more decent name and then 2 bye games, and then that will be it. So that's where we stand. There's a lot more to come. There's a lot of recruiting to come, and Parth will have you covered at the Daily Memphian. I'm telling you, this guy, I don't know where you get your sleep, because I guarantee you when you go to bed for a few hours, you wake up, 2 stories have happened. I mean, it's nuts.
I mean, we were talking about it before the podcast. You know, you wake up and boom, you're hit with something every other day seemingly, but it's always fun. It's always a blast.
It's better than the alternative. Parth, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Appreciate that. So big thanks to Parth Upadhyaya and Tim Buckley for joining us today. Of course, our producer, Natalie Van Gundy, always a terrific job. Be sure to check out our other podcast, the Daily Memphian's Food Podcast. That's called Sound Bites. It's hosted by Chris Harrington and Holly Whitfield. The Sidebar with Eric Barnes. It's about arts, culture, and everything in between. And the Grizzlies Podcast, also hosted by Chris Harrington with Drew Hill. All of our podcasts are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find podcasts. We'll talk to you again next week.